All right, so ladies and gentlemen, thank you once again for joining us for this webinar for today. Thank you to VillageReach for pulling this together and for SAPICS for hosting this, and just a great opportunity to speak about a topic that's very pertinent in our sector. It's really looking to see what are the opportunities for private sector as we play in this healthcare supply chain, which is often in the public sector space. So just thinking through that, maybe as an introduction, looking at public-private partnerships, it's a topic that, topic that's gone back for many years. Actually found some references to the early 1600s and into the 1700s, where private companies were investing. A good example in the States, where there was the opportunity for the growth of economy, but the government couldn't keep up with investing, and private companies got involved in building railway lines and roads to speed up that growth of the economy, benefit from it, but also help the country as a whole. My little definition that I suppose, put a few things together is that it's really about long-term contracting between government and private sectors to deliver public services in partnership. So it's working together for the good, but in partnership, and both entities need to benefit. So my name is David Crew-Brown. I'm the General Manager of Vital Alliance, but for today's call, I'm serving also as a Director on SAPICS, and that is my capacity that I'm on this call today. I'll be moderating the session with some great panelists, as you can see on your screen. And really my background, I come from private sector, spent 20 years in the large FMCG. I joined the healthcare environment, the healthcare supply chain, and really worked in the public sector for the last 5.5 years, going on 6 years now. And really found in those early days that there was really a lot of opportunity in the public sector. They seem to often be quite slow in doing things, quite behind in terms of supply chain process and systems from what I was used to, and often quite painful to get going. And I could really see how private sector experience using that in the public sector to help them move. And hopefully the bit that I've been able to do over the last 5.5 years has been helpful. What I did find is that there was a lot of willingness, people wanting to learn, people wanting to improve, people wanting to grow, and also making small changes coming from a private sector, using what some of the fundamentals are. You can actually do a lot in terms of moving things forward. One of my colleagues once said to me, as I was kind of playing in the space, they said to me, a good summary of private and public sector is that private sector will spend 80% of their time and effort designing a solution and 20% implementing it. Whereas in the public sector, you spend about 20% of your time and effort really designing a solution, but it's a significant effort in getting that implemented. And so, yeah, I think really as we start today, I think a topic close to all of our hearts. Thanks again for joining us. For those who've maybe joined late, we're going to have a conversation with our three panelists, really talking about this idea of private sector opportunities. We'll have a chance for Q&A, so please note down your questions. We're quite happy for you to put those in the chat. We'll try and consolidate those and then run through a few Q&A, and then we'll wrap it up with a final question to the panelists and an opportunity just to respond. So let me introduce our three panelists to you. First is Scott Dubin. He's a private sector engagement advisor to the Global Fund. He's played in the space for over 20 years, has deep experience, and has worked across NGOs, private sector, and for the US government. So Scott comes with a lot of, and as he mentioned in the pre-call discussion, this is the stuff that he eats, breathes and sleeps, this public sector engagement. We've also got Giovanni Ruggiero. He's the chief of party for a USAID project in Mozambique, experience in both public and private partnerships, in Mozambique, having been a very integral part of that project. So great to have Giovanni on the call. And then last but not least, Angelina Kumba, logistics outsourcing specialist, team lead in VillageReach, also with more than 20 years of experience, has worked in both for-profit and non-for-profit organizations, managing operations in the supply chain. So great to have these panelists with us today. And I'm going to start off by really directing a first question, Giovanni, maybe to yourself, really talking about if we think about your collaboration between the government and private sector in this public health space that we play in, it's really to improve the healthcare outcomes for patients at the end of the day. And we can do that by leveraging on that private sector experience and on the systems and the processes that they have. But there are often barriers for us to be able to achieve this. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about the barriers and the challenges that you're seeing in building these public-private partnerships and the collaboration that's coming, and just how do you collaborate for the good of business and for government?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me switch on the camera if you like it. Yeah, thank you, and good afternoon, everybody. So once again, my name is Giovanni Ruggero. So I've been working with AGL since the beginning of this project, this very project, which is called Sugar. It's important to say that, of course, AGL is a group. We provide logistics services all over the world. It's a worldwide organization. And the level of service we are actually providing to the government of Mozambique is important to state the fact that it's a tiny part of the supply chain. So that has implication about the speech I'm going to run, because of course we only provide the service related to the distribution of the pharmaceutical and vaccine from the provincial hubs. For hubs, I'm talking about warehouses, to the last mile of the health national, Mozambican health systems. So it is important to say that, because this actually gives you a good insight about the service and the level of the service we're providing. So it's not that big in a way, of course. We're talking about big money, big operation, but it's not all. So the first problem we encountered when we set up our operation in the provinces, because we operate for the entire country, it was like we found out that our partner, which is the government of Mozambique, the local authority, provincial in particular, the infrastructure, the inadequacy of the infrastructure for the job that they were supposed to, to carry out. And of course, the lack of human resources, specialized human resources, I would say, like in the supply chain, because most of them, of course, you can imagine, are trained in health-related topics, rather than knowing how to calculate and evaluate the volume of carton boxes. Can imagine that. And the impossibility, this is probably the biggest problem we have over the year, of integrating our management systems with the system in use by the local government. Of course, as you know, you might know that information-wise, this is basically what we're doing, is not just providing the service of transporting the goods, it's also collecting data. The quality of data is very important, and making reports. And once again, to be clear enough, we didn't sign with the government of Mozambique, we signed with the USA. So it's important to be said, because it's a kind of, it's good component in terms of reliability, in terms of payment, timely payment. So the group, of course, need to be ensured about the sustainability of the project. And this is one of the other concern I would like to bring on the table, because from now, to date, USA, and not just USA, the other parts made the effort to have the private sector engaged. But the systems, the payment system used, the mechanism, is just the one related to the government, United States government, and they're kind of, good in timely. They do timely payment, which is kind of important for our group, because as you can imagine, it's big operation. The invoice that we do every month is consistent. and the cash flow of the group would be impacted if any delays may occur, So this is kind of important to understand. One other thing we like to highlight that not all the 4PL, we operate as a 4PL. So we just provide not just the tracking service, many other services like handling and other services. Well, I don't go into details, of course, but it is quite a consistent of amount of money that we invoice every month. So let's put it this way, our partners are solvable, and that's very important for us. If it wouldn't be the case, that's, wouldn't last that long, I have to say. So this is probably another challenge I see in the future. Another one is like the group has very tight quality and safety measure requirements for all the vendors. So before being registered as a vendor for the group, you need to submit a series of documents, like, of course, license, insurance, and many others, due diligence, basically. And considering the job, the level of service we're providing, which is at the provincial level, the tracking services, the enterprises, well, the company we contracted, weren't able, weren't complying with the minimum requirement, I would say. So why is that so? Of course, the group had other contract in place, but the tracking company used for our, core business were solvable, and of course, big company. For this project, we had to, downsize the operation, the scale of the contractor. We actually address our request too, because we need like different means of transportation. We do deliver to the last mile, so it's not a big lorry what we're gonna use. It's mainly our like truck with the payload not exceeding the 4 tons, and pickup, also motorbikes, other means that are not actually, well, you can imagine a owner of a motorbike won't actually, just to get a license to transport goods and, pay the taxes. So just to make it simple to you, for you to understand, it's kind of difficult to actually conciliate, merge our requirement in terms of quality with the requirement or the quality of our supplier. So it was a big job. The first we had to do was actually to get compliant, or try to get all the supplier compliant within a decent time frame. So this is what I have to say. Of course, there is another incentive that we had as a group. It was the contract signed with USAID. I think it's good. It's a good contract. It's called cost plus incentive fees. Basically, we actually calculate. We got, of course, objectives and metrics to measure, which are on time, in full, the main one. So we got a rate, a percentage that we can apply on the allowable and allocable cost if we reach a certain tier of the objective we have. So we got rate. So this is kind of an incentive for us to invest and get the job done.
Giovanni, thanks so much. I think just maybe a quick question just off the back of that is what did you see in terms of the timeline to getting this going? I think you mentioned those challenges, infrastructure, your kind of skills, some of the systems. So what was the time frame? How long did it take? It sounds like there's a fairly good partnership going at the moment, but I'm sure that took a long time to get in place and mature.
It did. Well, it's difficult to say. There is a plan, which is called PALF. There is a reform that, of course, government is undertaking, but it started a long time ago, but it's still, I don't see anything big happening. They wanted to reassess, well, they reassessed the entire network in terms of warehousing, but just provincial. We're talking about the last mile. So the most, let's put it, say, the ward in a hospital or in a health post are not adequate to intake any goods. They have no space at all. So they increase the volume capacity, the stacking capacity of the provincial warehouses without thinking about the last mile. So there are two hypotheses. Either you just double the frequencies of the delivery, or I don't know what you want to do, because probably it's good to have like the goods stuck at the provincial level, because it's a difficult terrain, Mozambique, I have to say. It's a big country. The road accessibility, the infrastructure, poor, still, very poor, I would say. And the rainy season just complicates. Also the tropical cyclone, of course, it doesn't help. So yeah, that's what I wanted to say. The infrastructure are very poor, and we are for the continuous improvement. We got like standardized processes that could be actually applied or suggested to our counterpart. But unfortunately, let's put it this way: like just prepare the order like the day before. Yeah, you need to have space. Yeah, to do that, you have to have like dedicated space within the warehouse space, and this is possible just if you have that. So the infrastructure, it's very important. Without having like an up-to-date structure, they won't actually get any improvement done in a very short time of period. So it's like long term, probably if they gonna get it done completely, they figured it out to build 30 warehouses. Now they are reviewing the plan. They've done it just 5 out of the 30 in 10 years. So, and this is many other reforms should come afterwards. Of course, as you know, it's not just building. It's also, you need a decree. It's very political, and the shift of power, authority just complicates further the issue. And, you can imagine, what it is. It's not just, the infrastructure, it's how it's managed, also the administrative, issues related to the reform that should be tackled. So it's not an answer I can give you. Much depends on the political will of getting it done and the funds to complete the opera.
Great point. It sounds like good progress has been made, Giovanni, even though it's tough going with some of those early challenges. And thanks for kind of calling those out. Maybe we can move over to Angelina. And Angelina, I think from your guys' perspective, I mean, we've heard about these challenges that Giovanni's spoken about, and just, difficult to actually foster those relationships. But you guys have almost a bit of a case study. You've been able to do some of that collaboration also in Mozambique, building and nurturing a partnership and making it work. And maybe just share with us, what does it take to be able to do that, to build a partnership like that, and to make it exciting for the private sector to say, yes, I'm prepared to invest in this specific cause?
Oh, I was on mute. Thank you. Thank
There
you,
we go.
David. So, based on experience, establishing a form of collaboration between private and the government can be a challenging process. And you need to be patient and understanding. And as an organization, we have learned from actually doing it. So despite the challenges that we have faced during the introduction of outsourced concept in the government, we had to really identify ways on dealing with some of the barriers. So just to give you the context, the government solely managed their own distribution before. They were managing their own distribution operation, and which often faced disruption. Additionally, the concept of outsourcing was not even considered as a viable option. So, however, we did counter challenges, and one of the challenges was the resistance to the concept of outsourcing. And I think it was around the perception of outsourcing is expensive. We had also to deal with the situation of losing visibility and control, because remember, the government, they will be doing their own distribution for years. So losing the control of that to private sector was not something that the government was ready to do at that time. We had to deal with situation of fear of losing the jobs and overall worries around security and private, because they had to share, they have to start sharing the internal data information and with the external. So as the organization, we had to sort of sit down with the government and really go through an educational process in terms of what is outsource, what is the concept of outsource, and what it takes if you need to have effective outsource operations. So so this is also one of the approach that really help us, because it was going to put the government in a position of where we need them to have informed decision based on the data and really understand that, you know, they can leverage the private sector expertise. Because in reality, the private sector has the tools, has the expertise, and it has the knowledge in managing overall supply chain. So we also had to really focusing in the building the relationship, because, you know, then one we've seen based on experience, it doesn't really matter how good your solution is. It doesn't matter how much money you have. If you don't know how to work with government, if you don't understand the government working culture. So you must have trust and communication on like overall mutual respect is fundamental components, you know, for effective partnership, and underlining like the common goals and objectives. And lastly, I think I also want to underline that we also had face challenging around navigating the structural issues. You know, understanding and navigating these structural issues really requires, you know, patience, flexibility, and strategy planning. And as VillageReach, we are in Africa for more than 20 years, and we really understand what it needs, you know, to achieve something between public health sector and private sector. So our strategy was really to make sure that we have a clear and effective advocacy strategy that is very educational to the government and underlining the common benefit. What is the private sector going to benefit from this? And what is the government going to benefit from this? And not just like that. We also wanted to make sure that, you know, the government has a solution that is sustainable. Remember, I've mentioned that, you know, outsourcing to the last mile was not even an option. You know, there was those resistance, fear of like, you know, we are now losing control, fear of people losing the job, you know, fear of the overall concept of the outsource. So we had to really patience, taking the government step-by-step educational process to really understand what is outsource, what is the benefit of outsource, and how you can really leverage the expertise and the experience of outsource, and which is one of the reasons why you see AGL is one of the 3PL, 4PL identified to have the capability to start, you know, initiating this project in Mozambique. And we really see the effective and the benefit of this relationship now. Well, they're doing a good job. Thank you, David.
That sounds fantastic, Angelina. And maybe just a follow-on question to you. You know, I think definitely it's clear that you had to do a lot of convincing to the government that this outsourcing idea is a good idea. I mean, I think it's fairly widely known that private sector have advanced skills and capabilities, and that's why they do what they do and can do it in a profitable way. So I think that was clear, but I think losing control, just what's going to happen to people's jobs, I can understand that those are potentially challenging. Maybe the question that I do want to just probe is, for the private sector, you know, what convincing was there to be done in terms of the benefit that they would get? Of course, you know, it's commercial businesses, so they want to turn a profit. So that would be one of the drivers. But I remember when I just started in the public sector, I spoke to one of the suppliers that I'd previously worked with around system solution. And I said to him, hey, man, we need a system solution. I think what you've got is great. I think it's going to work in the public sector. And he came back to me and said, no, they've, as a company, decided that they don't work with a public sector because it's just not viable. They don't get paid in time. It's not highly profitable, and it's just takes a long time. It just wasn't worth it. And I was very surprised, because I was like, hey, I'm giving you a business opportunity, but yet they weren't interested. And I think there might be lots of private sector companies that will need some level of convincing. So any thoughts that you guys had of what you did around that exciting opportunity for private sector?
Yes, David. And you know what? One of the things that we have seen, based on our experience, is the perception about the government don't pay on time, or the government don't pay at all. It's really still a challenge, is to really, to really motivate the private sector to be in the picture. You see, so for this case specific for Mozambique, it was very easy because this is a donor-funded project. So the private sector knew that it was not going to be the government paying. It was going to be a donor, so it was an easy process. But if we look at other countries, if we really look at other countries, for example, Ethiopia, it's not a donor-funded project. It's the government, they're paying their own money. So there was a pre-assessment which was done to really understand the challenges that the private sector is facing. So those challenges they previously, discussed and addressed to really understand, okay, before we launch a tender, what is the current status in the market? What are the challenges that the private sector? So there was a dialogue between the government and the private sector to really understand, okay, what can we do to make sure that by the time that we launch the tender, most of the underlying issues are addressed and it's clear and the expectation is clear from the both sides. So it's different from country to country. The motivation is very high if it's not the government paying for the operations, but at the same time, it's changing. And we can see more and more private sector now. They are now engaging more, and they're now starting having more interest into the public sector activities because the dialogue is there. It's not the communication is there. So this is one of the things that I think we see is missing. This collaboration, interaction, and clear. The government needs to communicate the strategy. What is the plan, and make it like a transparent process. To motivate the private sector to trust the government processes.
Fantastic, Angelina. I think this is a good segue into really just calling Scott to join the conversation. So Scott, I think you've had so many years of experience in this space and really know this environment well, and have seen, I suppose, both the positives and the negatives, the negative perceptions that might influence people's desire to be part of this, and really governments sometimes, maybe as Angelina said, if it's donor funded, it's one thing, but if it's the government that you're dealing with, there's lots of reservations around challenges. But yeah, what have you seen has really worked to incentivize and help create that sustainable solution that Angelina spoke about, to say, well, you actually need to make sure that it's sustainable. The government can't be paying more for something that they paid for before, but at the same time, if they're getting a higher service, they need to know that it is going to cost. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. So how does one balance that, and how do you make sure that the private sector does want to engage with governments to do this work?
Yeah, thanks, David. And thank you to SAPICS and VillageReach for having me today, and appreciate all the attendees as well. It's great to speak about a topic I think near and dear to many of our hearts. And maybe I'll start out with some background and some caveat. First, I'm with the Global Fund, and we are a donor of public health initiatives focused on malaria, TB, and HIV, and we're based in Geneva, where I sit right now. And what we see, an aspect of this, there's the private sector, and then the donor plays a role, and so I'll touch upon that a little bit in where we see who can contribute and how. But I think it's important to caveat that we acknowledge that all governments are not the same. They have different levels of maturity, different dynamics, different markets that the private sector is operating at levels within their countries. So some of the recommendations and some of the things we're seeing, of course, are generalizations. And we, of course, don't look at outsourcing as just one thing that's outsourcing. That it involves many elements to it. And, if we had more time and other conversations kind of speak to each of those in more detail. But generally, we're talking about we put them into buckets, looking at how you determine what should be outsourced, looking at your own operations, looking at the market, and making that determination. The tendering process, the contracting process, the rollout process, if you will, as well, and then contract management and renewal and exit if need be. So that's how we kind of see the areas where we focus our attention around private sector and look to offer support. But if I break it up into government, private sector, and donors in terms of what we see to be beneficial to ensuring sustainable relationships and success, we see that government understanding what is a core competency of theirs and not related to logistics is very important. having good visibility into the costs and performance of their supply chain. Angelina mentioned that, where there's often the perception the private sector is very expensive, but it's very difficult to make a objective assessment if we're not already familiar with your own costs, your true cost, and your performance, so you can compare to what the private sector is offering. We see when there's a clear scope of what the work should be, what should be outsourced, having clear lines, and perhaps it's just distribution, perhaps we're starting with just long haul distribution, and looking at it in terms of phased approaches as opposed to trying to do it all at once, especially if outsourcing is new to that government. A framework for how the outsourcing is going to be managed, which departments will oversee which parts of the process is very critical to success. Implementing clear and transparent policies related to procurement, which will allow for enhanced confidence from the private sector. The use of performance-based contracting, we seem to be very key. Payment speed, Angelina mentioned this. I think in some cases, perhaps it's exaggerated, but in some cases it is real, the government paying in a reasonable time. So if need be, this is something to be addressed so that it's understood how it impacts the private sector and their interest in engaging in services provisions. On the private sector side, I think it's really important when we see the private sector acknowledging that there's asymmetry in terms of information about logistics and outsourcing, where the private sector has a lot more at times information than the customer, the government, if you will, and understanding that can create an impediment. And so addressing that is really key. We really like to see when private sector is implementing technologies that allow for digitization in terms of the transaction process, in terms of the tracking process, improved collection of metrics, we see to be very helpful because it helps to tell the story and make the case for performance that has been achieved in other activities, and that can be shared with governments to improve their understanding and confidence in the process. Of course, and this was mentioned earlier by Angelina, but the ability to integrate and share data is very key. This is what governments will need. So understanding those needs, having systems that are able to do that. And I think the the private sector, again, as Angelina alluded to, there might be false kind of idea in all cases that the government is difficult to work with. The public sector is difficult to work with. And where that's not applicable, it's important for the private sector to help reduce the perception that the public sector is hard to work with. And since I sit at a donor, I would say on the donor side, I think one thing that I see that we talk about a lot is the importance of reducing the level of effort and technical know-how required to oversee outsourcing activities, and that governments are in a different place than the implementers who've been doing this for a few decades now. And so what technologies can we use to reduce the technical know-how and level of effort to increase the likelihood of success around outsourcing activities? We believe we should support more development of guidance around outsourcing, so those who want to do it can also use resources on their own. But certainly we should provide technical assistance around outsourcing. Donors have spent a lot of time providing technical assistance related to how to run warehouses and fleets and so on. But on outsourcing specifically, we have not provided a great deal of technical assistance. So that's something important for us to be shifting towards. I think we have had a lot of conversations about innovative finance related to the procurement of product, but the procurement of services is probably an area where we should think about innovative finance, because there is a question of should terms be extended to governments or to logistics providers to help address this issue with on-time payments, because it's real, and we can't ignore it as part of something that will contribute to success. And donors, and kind of lastly, donors could incentivize the use of the private sector by benchmarking costs, saying where they want to be with costs, having expectations of governments of what type of costs they should be running their systems at. And then that would, help bring costs down for governments and find efficiencies, but also help make the case to move to outsourcing when there's clearly a benefit financially and in terms of performance. Over from my side. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I think maybe just one quick follow-on from my end is that I really like that idea of the benchmarking, that trying to really get to understand where do your costs match up. And really, from my experience, I've seen that ministries often look at a solution that gets provided by public sector and say, oh, that's very expensive, but maybe haven't looked at the total, what I think people call the total cost of ownership. So the total chain, maybe they've got very high losses, but they don't measure those losses. And so they don't account that in to say, well, we can get rid of this waste in the system if we had to do it in a different way, and maybe bring in that strategic partnership to be able to enable that. Is that something that you've seen that governments in places do try and really unpack that cost properly, and not just say, well, currently I'm paying X dollars per kilometer for my truck, now I must pay that so much more, but they didn't look at what the warehouse operation is, and service levels and turnaround times and all sorts of other factors that will actually also bring costs into the chain.
Yeah, we haven't seen a lot of solid understanding of costs and performance. Certainly it happens here and there, but it is quite difficult to quantify the costs, and it involves we've seen a large level of technical assistance to truly understand all the costs related to the system, because sometimes it gets complicated in terms of who's paying for such staff, and maybe staffing they're not thinking about because they're paid maybe by the ministry, and the central medical store is thinking about assets but not depreciation, and so on. But we find that it's a large undertaking that isn't often necessarily funded. We are moving to outsourcing without understanding the costs, or other activities where it would be helpful to know the costs now and the performance now before we start doing other interventions. And we see often that it's not as robustly known as it could be. And as we want to start heading in the direction, we believe this would be very beneficial for the discussion of outsourcing, because it's so hard to have the discussion to outsource if one doesn't know their own costs and their performance, because we're not really comparing it against anything. And then ultimately, once you've started outsourcing, to know whether it was worth your while or not, you should be looking backwards and saying, is there cost efficiency, is there performance improvement? And part of understanding cost and performance, we also are recommending that you're looking at what are your needs, what are you trying to achieve, improve customer service, and improve flexibility, improve resiliency, improve technical solutions as part of, like, if you start understanding the needs as well, it also helps to understand what is capable to be accomplished by insourcing, and what really needs to happen through outsourcing. So we really don't want to skip that kind of beginning step. For us, is understanding cost, performance, and needs, requirements is really a first step before even thinking about outsourcing and assessing the market and so on.
Yeah, thanks, Scott. And really, one thing that comes to mind, I do a lot of work. So Vital Alliance's parent companies, Imperial Logistics, now DP World. And really in that space, there's a lot of appetite, or, there is appetite for the business to actually do work at risk, to say, well, let's together quantify the opportunity. Let's do a clear baseline of where we're at. And then any profits, any savings that we generate, we'll share in those. And we want 25 or 30% share. So it's almost the government can say, well, if there's no savings, then we don't have to pay anything. But if there are savings, and we've agreed that this is how we measure it, and I think there are pitfalls to that process as well, but I think those are maybe ways. I see we've had a couple of good questions come through on the chat, so thank you for those, and I see some really good comments as well. I've got a first question maybe as we go into the Q&A, and if there are any others, please share. We've got probably about 15 minutes or so, 10 minutes for a bit of Q&A. So the first question, Angelina, is for you, and it says, it sounds like trust and partnership building was very important in the work in Mozambique. Do you think having a connector organization like VillageReach is the only option to creating that public-private partnership? And that is directed, Angelina, to yourself, if you could hear that clearly.
Hey, Dev, sorry, can you repeat the question? Sorry.
Yeah, it was really saying that that the trust and partnership building was very important in the work you did, and having a connector organization like yourselves, is that the only option in creating that public-private partnership, or are there other ways in your thoughts?
No, like, yeah, trust trust is really very important, but coming through the organization like us is not only the only option, but you have to understand when you're bringing something new, outsource was new to the government. And it's really very important for the government to trust, to trust the solution, to really understand the whole concept before they said yes. So it's not just about our organization, because we've experienced working with the government, but whoever who wants to approach the government, it really needs to understand the government strategy and priorities, need to understand their challenges. Trust is something that you need to build. It doesn't matter whether you go through the organization, you really need to be able to really understand how the government works, really understand their problems, you need to understand, the challenges and all those barriers that are involved in whatever solution that you're proposing. So I'll say to the person who asked the question, say, no, you don't need only the organization like us to the government strategy. So you really need to understand the government needs, and also to really sell your solution that respond to the government needs. It's not just about coming out with a solution. The government should be able to trust you to really say that, okay, this is a valuable solution. You really understand my needs, really understand the problem that I'm facing. And yes, this solution can help me. And again, you don't need to bring a solution that is going to be implemented at the big scale. We have seen the benefits of starting in a very small scale. You need to have a results-based driven solution. Show to them how it works, make them understand how it works, make them understand that you understand their problems, and your solution will be able to fix their problem.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Thanks, Angelina. Next question, Scott, I think was directed to you. If you can take a stab at it. The question is that you mentioned information asymmetry, and the private sector may have more information than the government has access to. Sharing that knowledge and having data operability seems important to the overall success of the supply chain. Is there, or are there any places where you've seen this done well, or any systems you can recommend to make that process easier?
I haven't seen it done well in relation to outsourcing in our context. I think what this reminds me of the situation you see in the getting your car fixed in the auto repair industry, where those fixing your car have way more information about how this goes than you do, and it makes it for a very uncomfortable engagement, one that people put off, and you're not quite sure, did I need a new transmission? Is that the right price for a transmission? Did you do the work properly? And so that lack of information causes hesitancy to engage. It causes not a great relationship moving forward. And so, you could take lessons from even that situation where there's transparent pricing would be beneficial in that area, right? It would be beneficial in ours, where we have very little transparency in terms of pricing. It's not as if a customer is able to really understand what the price tends to be. It's something that doesn't come until you've had a long contracting process. The development of educational content, I think, would be very helpful for mitigating some of these issues, right? In terms of the private sector helping governments how to understand their own needs, how to manage logistics from an external provider, maybe sharing as part of transparent pricing, what is the cost buildup, sharing metrics, if you will, from other work that's been done. But I think you could take lessons learned from things outside of the outsourcing of logistics, where there's kind of asymmetry in terms of knowledge regarding the service that's being provided between the customer and the provider.
Yeah, great, and I love that that taking your car to the mechanic and being dependent on what he says because he holds the knowledge. Yeah, it's a good analogy. So Giovanni, maybe just to bring you back into our conversation, there's a question that says, what type of private sector skills or services are useful to governments for supply chain partnerships?
Yeah, that's indeed what actually Scott was saying. Like data gathering, that's what we do. We had already many of the tracking system we use. here were developed further for this very project. So we just didn't have to start, everything from scratch. We just took one of the system we use in Malawi for one of our client, and we just decided the specification. We just developed it further. We asked, and that was one of the constraints I was highlighting before, in the process of defining the technical specification, we asked to have the entire list of pharmaceutical, let's put it this way, whatever they got in stock. And they refused because, of course, it's just, it's government information or data, probably sensitive data, but it would have been a good idea to have the system interfaced. Yeah, that's for sake of occurrency and data standardization. Unfortunately, we couldn't, so we had to create another time a parallel system that has to duplicate, the processes that are done. You know what I mean. This is probably what we're doing best, and all the data, and also not only data on time in full or whatever indicator you want to measure. I'm talking about money. Yeah, so the cost of the operation, cubic meters by destination, kilometers, this kind of data are actually gathered with the use of the system we have in place. So we work it out. Well, we're still in a phase of development of the system. So this is another thing I wanted to say. This is something, is a cost anyway. We're talking about cost that doesn't figure in the bill you submit. There is a huge component which is done by the people that is troubleshooting the system on a daily basis. They're sitting in France, they're sitting in South Africa. This is not back charge. So you want to talk about cost? Yeah, this is huge, and this is within the group, and this is the added value we can bring on. We're not here to reinvent the wheel. We have a developer, software developer that they're doing it for us on a daily basis. So probably this is the biggest, and in a way, you cannot compare before. I mean, I'm not aware about any of this information. I mean, for the distribution done before we came over here in Mozambique and doing it. So I don't have an idea what was the cost. Most of the time they come to me and say it's very expensive. I said, to which, I mean, if you compare to what, because they didn't know, to be honest. Yeah. So we got data information that, that's what I wanted to say.
Thanks, Giovanni. I think we got maybe time for one last question. I do see a raised hand, but I'm going to unfortunately not be able to get to all the questions today. There's one more question, and maybe I can kind of throw it to the panelists to see who wants to try and take a stab. It's what role do government regulations play in facilitating or hindering the formation of operation of public-private partnerships in healthcare systems? So just the role of regulations and what role the government plays in setting those to help the process along.
I'm happy to take a stab and let others jump in. It's a complicated question, and I think the regulation is tied to various elements of outsourcing, because as I mentioned, there's just purely the procurement process and how it's undertaken, and how the tendering process goes, and might not be as transparent as maybe the private sector would want. The contracting process may be more complicated than it needs to be, and there's really only so much that's in their current design of RFPs and contracting that allows for kind of performance-based incentives as part of contracting. We've seen where if there's going to be savings and revenue savings, for example, that's being shown, where does that savings go as part of the regulation? Is it automatically move back to the treasury or whatever the name is for that specific country? But the savings might not be realized by that specific entity who might be most interested. And if that's not the case, there's less of an incentive. And I don't want to make this sound like this is only in relation to the governments we're talking about. I've previously worked for USAID, and our procurement process is quite complicated and would be a deterrent to some people wanting to participate in the procurement process. And And then once you have a contract, the reporting requirements and adherence to procurement regulations is very complicated, and you need people who have that expertise. And so it is complicated for governments in general. I don't want to decipher between ones that we're talking about in this context versus just pretty much every government that exists. So it's I think getting feedback from the private sector is important and letting the governments know how these requirements are hindering what they're trying to ultimately accomplish. Over.
Thanks, Scott. I think maybe that leads us to just a bit of a wrap up, and maybe if I can ask a question to all three panelists around just advice that you would give a private sector manager who really wants to engage with governments on the health supply chain. What would be those maybe 1 or 2 or 3 nuggets of advice that you would provide? I think there's been a lot out of this call, so I think maybe some of it's just summarizing, but yeah, what would you say would be that advice that you would give to somebody who wants to progress in these partnerships?
So, Dave, I don't know if I should start.
Let's go ladies first, for sure.
Yes, so according to our experience as an organization, we truly believe that you really need to understand the government strategy and priorities. We've seen that, if you are able to understand the government needs, to understand the government working culture and regulation, it's really going to help you to position yourself in terms of what solution can you design, for the government, and engage with the government, in constant basis. You don't have to meet with the government because there is a tender. You really need to develop that relationship, that constant communication, to really understand how things are working. The same way that a marketing manager is going out there in private sector, look for business, presenting the services, it's applicable to the government. You need to be able to sell yourself, to sell your service to the government, really understand what are your capabilities as a private sector, to be able to, to get your solution, sell to public sector.
I like that. Know what their problems are, know where their pain point is, and then build relationships so that you can build that trust that you spoke about earlier in the space. Yeah, maybe Scott, over to you. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think just in a really simple way, I would say that if I was helping the private sector, I would help them understand who to talk to in any specific given country that we're talking about. It can be very complicated for the private sector to know who to engage with if they're looking to provide services. So I think there's that. I think sometimes the idea is just that we need to convince governments they need to outsource just by saying, look how great we operate. We can bring lots of efficiencies and great performance. But I think it's really important for the private sector to understand the challenges that would prevent the the government from outsourcing. It's not for a lack of knowing in some cases it is, but it's not always a lack of knowing or only the lack of, or only worried about the performance. It is often there is constraints within governments in relation to their ability to manage an outsourcing provider, to do the proper procurement process, to understand their own requirements and help make decisions for outsourcing. So if the private sector understands the challenges the government might be facing, and each government will be unique, then it helps the private sector know how can they help the government in some of the challenges they have. And not all of them they can help them with, but there's more than just letting them know that the private sector is going to do an excellent job. I think that's just part of the conversation. Over.
Yeah, thanks. I think definitely valuable making sure that you kind of put yourself in their shoes, understand the challenges that they have, and that they're not just being difficult, but there might be policy, or there might be, other factors outside of the great idea that you're bringing to the fore. And then how do you creatively help overcome those? I think that would be a good challenge to the private sector to be able to engage. Maybe just Giovanni, how about you? What do you think the advice, or what advice would you be giving to people who want to play in the space?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, probably don't save money and don't quality when you want to end control. Because most of the time when you work in a developed country, when you talk about drugs, pharmaceutical, it's better to have like a certain control over the loading processes. Yeah, this kind of thing, you need to be like embedded personnel, like your own personnel doing the accountancy, to be accounted for the things you want to deliver. Most of the time, the rules in place are not sufficient, adequate to, to grant you like a reimbursement in case something is wrong. Give you a simple example: vaccine, a product that you should transport under controlled temperature. I never received like any documentation saying that the product that was handed over to me was kept under that controlled temperature. So at the other end, this kind of problem can be actually rose up. Let's pretend my cargo, arrive at the other end. So it's better to have somebody there to troubleshoot this kind of problem and witnessing them and trying to solve it straight away. So when you just put together the project, I believe a big component is still human resources. Yeah, you should consider that. It's not just tracking system that can sort out the problem. Many of the problems we face are related to operation and like inadequacy of the structure. So you have to troubleshoot them with your own resources, and you need somebody to be there and coordinate this big effort. Because overall, this is the biggest task we have. Like, just put together all the pieces that they scatter all over the place and just make it happen on time in full. So, but you need somebody there you can trust. You cannot delegate it to your trucking service, to the driver. You need to have somebody embedded in the operation. You outsource yourself as a 4PL.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Giovanni. And really, again, maybe a quick reflection from my end. I've seen in working with the Ministry of Health here in South Africa, at least, that often putting some of your people in the offices of the ministry, working alongside them, saying that actually we're a team. We're not actually trying to take some of the work away. We're also not trying to do something in a black box and sort of hand it over. So sometimes there's an opportunity to almost say, well, how do we work as a team and work alongside some of the Ministry of Health colleagues to try and strengthen that process? I see you kind of saying, well, it could go both ways, and I can see that, but we found it being very beneficial having built those relationships. What Angelina was talking about, having that relationship, understanding their pain, but being able to respond with a quality solution and a quality service. So I think that's been valuable to us. I want to just, on behalf of everyone who was on this call, just say a big round of thanks. Maybe if there's emojis, I don't know, on Zoom, but just a round of applause from all of us. Thank you for sharing your knowledge. Thank you for sharing your expertise, to the VillageReach team for pulling this together. Thank you for getting these great panelists on the call. And maybe if there's any follow-up information that we can send, maybe I'll just connect in with the VillageReach guys, but maybe there's some good content that people can turn to be able to further explore some of the topics that we've discussed today. But yeah, from me, on behalf of SAPICS and the team that joined us today, thank you very much. And signing out, enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Bye.